Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I'm joined by Christoph. Hey, buddy.
Hey man, how you doing? Good to speak to everybody. Hello, everybody. That's what I'm trying to say. Hello.
Picture a night watchman on the deck of a British tanker anchored in San Nicolas Harbor on the southeastern tip of the Dutch island of Aruba, just before 2 in the morning on February 16th, 1942. He can see the refinery lights on shore, the Lago Oil and Transport Plant, a Standard Oil subsidiary, close enough that he could probably hit it with a thrown wrench. He is not thinking about the war. Pearl Harbor is 10 weeks old. The fighting is somewhere else. The Philippines, North Africa, the gray water off Iceland. Nobody told him that a 250-foot German submarine has spent the last 3 days laying submerged off his own harbor mouth, watching him, counting his ship's draft, waiting for the moon to set. Hold that image in your mind because it's the whole war in miniature. An ocean everyone assumed was America's safe backyard, about to become a shooting gallery. Here's what the Watchmen didn't know, and what almost nobody outside a few Admiralty offices understood in February of 1942. The Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico were, at that exact moment, arguably the single most strategically important stretch of water on the planet. Not the most famous, not the most fought over in popular memory. The most important. Here's why. The Royal Dutch Shell Refinery on Curacao, Aruba's sister island 40 miles east, was processing 11 million barrels of petroleum a month, more than any other refinery on Earth. The Lago plant on Aruba itself was right behind it. Across the water on Trinidad, the refinery at Point a Pierre was the largest in the entire British Empire. Venezuelan crude oil came up out of Lake Maracaibo, got refined on these three Dutch and British isles, and then sailed north and east in tanker convoys to keep the lights on in London. Britain needed 4 tankers of petroleum a day, every day, just to keep functioning. And with Italy's navy blockading the Mediterranean route from the Middle East, nearly all of it now came from right here. That's the oil half of the equation. The other half is aluminum. American aircraft production, the fighters and bombers that were supposed to win this war, depended on bauxite ore. And bauxite was one of the only strategic raw materials the continental United States couldn't dig out of its own ground. Almost all of it came from British Guiana on the northern coast of South America, shipped up a corridor running past the Lesser Antilles, the same string of islands sitting directly astride the sea lanes into the Caribbean. And south of all of it sat the Panama Canal, the hinge the entire two ocean navy swung on. So, oil for Britain, aluminum for American bombers, and the canal that let the U.S. Navy be in 2 oceans at once. Take any one of those away, and you don't just hurt an island economy. You put a chokehold on the entire Allied war machine. The Americans knew it, which is why hundreds of Army bombers and fighters were already stationed defending the canal. And why on February 11th, 1942, 5 days before our watchman's bad night, U.S. troops had just relieved the British garrisons on Aruba and Curacao and started flying Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers out of 2 brand new island airstrips. The Americans were moving. They were just 5 days too late. Because the man who'd been thinking about this water a lot longer than the Americans was a 50-year-old German admiral named Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm. the coldest and most methodically brilliant man in the Kriegsmarine. 2 months earlier, Donitz had sent his submarines across the Atlantic to hammer the U.S. eastern seaboard in an operation the Germans called Paukenschlag, or drumbeat, and found American coastal shipping running with its lights on. No blackout, no convoys, no escorts. Exactly like a training exercise. Donitz wasn't a man who left an opportunity like that sitting on the table. If the eastern seaboard was undefended, what about the oil islands further south, where nobody had even finished building the airstrips yet? The answer came aboard a Type IXC submarine called U-156. And the man Donitz picked to lead the opening strike was Captain Lieutenant Weinar Hartenstein, 33 years old, already one of the more capable boat commanders in the fleet. Donitz codenamed the operation Neuland, or Newland, and gave Hartenstein 4 sister boats to bring with him: U-502, U-67, U-129, and U-161, spread out to hit multiple refineries at once, on the same night, in the same hour. No wolf packs hunting together. Single boats, independent, simultaneous. A coordinated ambush across 400 miles of water that not one Allied commander in the region saw coming. Hartenstein had already spent 3 days running U-156 submerged in the shallows off San Nicolas Harbor, close enough to make his own crew nervous, just watching. Studying the anchorage, counting tankers, waiting for a moonless night. That night was February 16th. And in a few hours, this entire theater, the oil, the aluminum, the canal, all of it, was about to get a very rude introduction to just how exposed it really was.
So I'm very glad you started with the date, because that gives me the proper mindset based on what we've been talking about the past several episodes about where the Americans' thinking was and what ideas they had come up with in what time frame. And this early after, Pearl Harbor. I was going to say September 11th. That doesn't make sense.
That's in the
This
future.
early, yeah. This is a different episode.
That's my conflict.
Right. This early after Pearl Harbor, like you said, there were no convoys, really. That idea had not gained traction. The blackouts may have been an idea here and there, but it wasn't standard protocol, I don't think, at this point. And so all the advantages are for the submarine. We don't have a lot of effective anti-submarine tactics or technology. And so knowing, like you said, the background of the necessity of the petroleum or any kind of oil products for the British Empire to run, just to survive, this is a key element of their war machine and just their empire. Yeah, this is a nice big fat apple that the Germans would like to pick. And I'm sure as you were describing it, I'm like, oh no, this is gonna go sideways quickly. But I'm sure, given the importance of this location, that they too would understand its importance and defend it accordingly, I'm imagining. But maybe they're just too little too late, and that happens a lot. It's, yes, we have the idea, yes, let's implement it, but by the time you do, the enemy's already beat you to the punch. So I'm curious to see how this unfolds.
At 01:31 in the morning on February 16th, 1942, a U-156 surfaced roughly a mile offshore from San Nicolas Harbor, and Weinar Hartenstein gave the order to fire. 2 British tankers sat at shore, loaded with crude, running normal harbor lights because nobody had told them not to. The first torpedo hit the tanker Pedernales amidships. She was carrying raw crude oil, and crude oil, once it's aerosolized by an explosion, doesn't just burn. it detonates like a fuel air weapon. Pedernales went up in a sheet of flame that killed 8 of her 26 crew instantly and burned her captain, Herbert McCall, bad enough that he'd carry the scars for the rest of his life. A second torpedo hit the tanker Urania Strait. A third struck Arkansas. The boat, not the state. Now hold that scene and put a second one right beside it, because this is a hallmark of how this campaign actually worked. Parallel disasters unfolding at the same hour, 40 miles apart, with none of the victims having any idea the others existed. At almost the identical moment, U-67, a sister boat under a different, equally aggressive young captain, slipped into Sint Ann Bay and the harbor of Willemstad on Curacao, and fired 4 torpedoes from her bow tubes at 3 tankers lined up in the harbor. All 4 were duds. Think about that for a second. A submarine gets a nearly point-blank shot at anchored, motionless tankers in a harbor she spent hours sneaking into, and the ordnance simply fails. It's the kind of mechanical letdown that got U-boat crews killed elsewhere in this war. Moments where hesitation to reload cost a boat its escape window. U-67 recovered, swung her stern tubes around, and put a torpedo into the tanker Rafaela, sinking her. 2 tankers escaped Curaçao's harbor that night purely because German torpedoes' fuses failed. That's luck. And this whole campaign runs on exactly that kind of luck, both ways, again and again. Meanwhile, a third boat, U-502, working the stretch of water between Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela and Aruba's western approaches, sank 3 crude oil tankers outright. Monagas, Tijuana, and San Nicolas. 3 separate refinery complexes, 3 different colonial flags flying over them. Dutch on Aruba and Curacao, British influence over the Trinidad crude trade, American oil money running through all of it. And in the span of about 90 minutes, 5 tankers were sunk or burning, and a 6th badly damaged. And not one of the 3 U-boat captains involved had said a single radio word to the other. That's what a coordinated, simultaneous strike from independently operating boats looks like. And it is the doctrine Carl Nitz had built the U-boat arm to execute. Back at Aruba, Hartenstein wasn't finished. With his torpedoes spent on the harbor tankers, he decided to surface U-156 and turn his 10.5 centimeter deck gun on the Lago refinery itself. An attempt to do to the plant what he'd just done to the tankers. And here the night takes its strangest turn. Before you file a naval deck gun, you're supposed to remove the tampion, the watertight plug fitted into the muzzle to keep seawater out of the barrel when the gun isn't in use. Somebody on Hartenstein's gun crew forgot. The first shell fired hit the plug still loaded in the barrel, and the gun burst apart in a spray of shrapnel. Matrozengoff Businger, a seaman on the gun crew, was killed instantly. The gunnery officer, Diedrich von den Born, lost his right leg in the blast and had to be put ashore for medical treatment on Martinique, surviving the war as a result. Hartenstein's attempt to level an entire refinery, arguably the most economical damaging single strike available to him that night, ended with his own weapon destroying itself on the first shot, at the cost of one of his men's lives and another's leg, and only a scorched storage tank to show for it. There's a strange mercy buried in that failure too, whether Hartenstein's crew ever recognized it or not. An American A-20 Havoc light bombers flying off the brand new Aruba and Carago airstrips the U.S. had occupied just 5 days earlier, scrambled and attacked all 3 submarines. They hit nothing. Not one bomb landed close enough to matter. So add it up. 5 ships sunk or burning, a German gun crew maimed by their own weapon, a rescue improvised by a small nation's Coast Guard vessel, and an air response that fired everything it had and achieved absolutely nothing. If you're keeping score after hour 1 of this campaign, the advantage belongs entirely, lopsidedly, to 5 German U-boats operating without radar, without air cover, and without a single shot fired back at them that actually landed. Think about what that meant for the men actually living through it, not the men reading the after-action report. Herdenal's survivors went into the water with burning crude oil, spreading across the surface around. A horrific way to die at sea, where the ocean itself catches fire. 18 of the 26 men made it, which by the arithmetic of a torpedoed tanker in open flames is close to a miracle. Captain McCall would be pulled from the water, scarred badly enough that photographs of him afterward are hard to look at. And he went right back to sea. That's the part of the tonnage tables never capture. Not just the ships, but the list of men expected to climb back onto the next tanker in the queue because the oil still had to move. War or no war. Burned captain or not. And on the other side of this, remember that not one American or Dutch defender fired a shot that hit anything. 2 islands worth of anti-aircraft guns, 2 brand new airstrips full of bombers, a Venezuelan gunboat's worth of goodwill, and the entire defensive effort that night amounted to pulling survivors out of burning water after the fact. The gap between what should have been possible and what actually happened is the story of the entire opening month of this campaign.
That is how I'm going to frame this entire sequence of events. I'm impressed by the incredible coordination by the U-boats without radio communication. I think that's what consistently helped them to have the advantage so long early in the war. I can't believe there wasn't a mechanical disabling on the muzzle cover that disallowed you from firing the weapon. So,
Oh no, it allowed you
like
to fire it once.
No, I know. Right, they shouldn't be that. So think about the planes of World War I, right? You have machine guns mounted on the planes right behind the propeller. And you do not want your bullets to destroy your propeller, so you have an interrupter gear that disallows you from firing. It doesn't fire the bullet such that it would hit the propeller. It fires between the propeller as it's spinning, which is incredible. It doesn't take that much to have a little switch at the end of the gun that, when covered with the cap, that says this will not fire. You know what I mean? Because their guns are so effective that, yep, if you say fire, we're going to fire, and boom, that's exactly what happened. And then disaster. When at first, as you were describing that, before you said that guy lost his leg, I pictured just a mess. It's a mess. I understand how the bombers would be scrambled. You need to respond as quickly as you can with whatever you have in the area. They do not have good countermeasures, like I said earlier, against submarines, especially dropping bombs. That's it. At this point, it's surface ships can avoid those bombs easy enough. Once they can see what's happening, they can divert a little bit, move. They might be affected by the wave of the impact, but submarines are a different story altogether. So this is
not only that, but this is
a mess.
Also at night, which makes it compound
even worse.
Yeah, it compounds the problems for dropping ordnance on target even worse. Especially moving targets.
Yeah, absolutely. Those that are meant to be invisible practically. And I'm sure was a wake-up call to the Allies. Hey, you better figure this out, because you have a bunch of sitting ducks out here, and if you have no countermeasures, they're just going to run wild. They're going to rule the sea.
Everything at early in the war was a wake-up call.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it started with a giant wake-up call at Pearl Harbor and continued to have a series of wake-up calls like, oh, yeah, we need to think about that. Oh, yeah, we need to consider that too. And then, like we've described in previous episodes, the U.S. Navy adapts, does learn from each of these episodes and goes, not our podcast episodes, but each of these conflicts and engagements, what to do better next. And so this is just an unfortunate early in the war. We don't know a whole lot. Let's use the doctrine we had.
2 days after Aruba burned, on February 18th, a sixth U-boat, U-161, pushed into the Gulf of Paria between Trinidad and the Venezuelan coast and torpedoed the freighter Mokihama and the tanker British Consul. That's the pattern you need to understand for everything that follows in this early phase. This was never a single raid. Operation Nutlant was designed as an opening blow, and then the same boats were simply supposed to stay on station and keep hunting. And that's exactly what they did for the better part of a month, essentially unopposed. U-67 went back to work and sank the tankers J.N. Pugh and Penelope. U-502 sank Kingsguard, Thela, and Sun, 3 more tankers, on top of the 3 she'd already claimed on opening night. Arnstein's U-126, its deck gun sawn down with hacksaws to remove the burst section, kept hunting with what was left of the barrel, sinking Del Flat and the tanker Le Carré, and when the torpedoes finally ran out entirely, used that mutilated hacksawed gun to sink 2 more ships, McGregor and Oregon. U-161 sailed clear across the St. Lucia and on March 10th actually entered Castries Harbor and torpedoed the passenger liner Lady Nelson and the freighter Umtata inside the anchorage itself. A second harbor penetration weeks after Aruba that nobody had found an answer for yet. On the way out, that same boat sank the U.S. Ikesa, a Coast Guard lighthouse tender with gunfire alone. And Germany wasn't even the only Axis power in these waters. 5 Italian submarines were operating on the Atlantic side of the Lesser Antilles during this same window. Flying the flag of a navy most Americans forgot was even capable of transatlantic submarine operations. Morosini sank the tanker Pedor Bogen and the freighter Stothgart. Tuzili sank the tanker Antaquin. Gallipoli Fonzi sank 2 more tankers. The Italian submarine Leonardo da Vinci sank a Latvian vessel serving with the Allies. This was not a 2-navy war down here. It was a genuinely multinational hunting ground. And every one of those flags represented a fresh set of Allied convoy planners who had to somehow account for threats coming from directions they haven't even fully mapped yet. On March 3rd, a German boat surfaced off the tiny Puerto Rican island of Muna and simply started shelling it. No strategic target, no military value, just presence. A demonstration that nowhere in this theater was actually safe. No damage, no casualties, but that's not really the point in an act like that. It's psychological. It says we can reach anywhere we choose. Then on April 19th, Ernst Klaas, commanding U-130, tried to repeat Hartenstein's failed refinery bombardment, shelling the storage tanks on Curacao again. This time, a Dutch shore battery answered back within 5 shots and forced him to break off and run. Progress. Slow, but real. The defenders were starting to shoot back and occasionally hit something close to correct. By late April, the numbers coming back to Washington and London were becoming impossible to explain, always as bad luck. Dozens of tankers sunk in 10 weeks. Several major refineries either damaged or under direct fire. 2 harbor penetrations that put a torpedo inside supposedly protected anchorages, and not one confirmed U-boat kill to show for any of it. Oil company executives, the men who actually owned Lago and the Royal Dutch Shell interest in Carigou, were putting real pressure on Washington and London both, because insurance underwriters were starting to balk at covering tanker runs through these waters at any price, and merchant captains were quietly refusing berths on the Caribbean run. That's a kind of crisis that doesn't show up in casualty figures. An oil supply chain that depends entirely on civilian merchant crews being willing to sail into it, starting to seize up from simple fear, one refused assignment at a time. The Navy's answer for now was Finn. More PBY Catalina patrol flights out of Trinidad and Puerto Rico. A scattering of armed guard details put aboard tankers that had sailed completely unarmed before this. And urgent cables asking for destroyers that didn't exist in the numbers needed, because most of the U.S. Navy's escort strength was still tied up, protecting the North Atlantic convoy routes to Britain. There was no coastal convoy system yet. Ships were still sailing independently, on published schedules. Past a coastline German intelligence had already mapped in detail from pre-war merchant traffic. Every one of these Caribbean sinkings was, in a very real sense, a preventable loss. Not because anyone was incompetent, but because the escorts required to prevent it simply didn't exist yet in this theater. And building them from nothing in wartime takes months the men on those tankers didn't have. Then came the moment that changed the diplomatic map of this war entirely. On May 14th, Reinhard Zuren, U-564, sank the Mexican tanker Retero del Llano off Florida. A week later, on May 21st, Herman Reinks U-106 sank a second Mexican tanker, Fujada Uro, off Key West. 16 Mexican sailors died across the two attacks. Mexico had been neutral. Mexico had no quarrel with Germany. And on May 22nd, 1942, Mexico declared war on Germany, Italy, and Japan, pulled directly into the global conflict not by a grand diplomatic betrayal, but by 2 U-boat captains sinking 2 tankers that happened to be flying a flag Berlin apparently hadn't bothered to check for. Karl Dönitz submarines had, almost as an afterthought, just added an entire nation to the enemy list.
I would think that as a submarine, I know they have periscopes, but you're probably... Are you in the business of checking flags? I guess you don't want to sink your own ships, right?
Right.
But if you're in the Western Hemisphere, you probably don't have a lot of Allied shipping, right? There's not a lot of German shipping or Italian shipping in the Caribbean, I would imagine. So it could be that I'm just going to destroy everything, because there could be a Mexican tanker flying under a Mexican flag helping the British and the American war effort by transporting their oil, right?
Well, yes and no.
No, it's a risky proposition. I
Yeah.
agree. You don't want to just shoot at ships willy-nilly, regardless of what flag they're flying.
Right.
But I think...
And they don't. They do identify the ships before they fire upon them.
Right.
Including the flag.
Right.
Yeah,
but if one was sunk off the coast of Key West, probably heading to and from America with, if it's a tanker of oil, I'm sure supplies for the American war effort, and that's something they want to minimize. And maybe Germany is just so confident in their submarine fleet, then it's like, yeah, let Mexico come in. What are they going to do? Send ships to us? We'll sink them. That at this point, they have the overwhelming advantage. So it could just be, yeah, we're willing to do that and deal with them as they come. which I think is very aggressive. It doesn't make sense from a traditional military standpoint. I wouldn't think. You don't want to, like you said, you don't want to pull in other countries against you.
Right. Well, there's two ways to think about this. First, because they are servicing the U.S., it makes them a valid target. But they're flying a neutral nation's flag, which flips the script on that. So you have to make a decision. You can fire on a target that is supplying your enemies and risk aggravating that sovereign country, or you can let that sovereign country just have free reign to keep supplying your enemies. It's not an easy decision to make, and it should not have been made by a captain on a boat somewhere in the
Do you think that it
Atlantic.
was? You don't think that may have come down from higher up?
I don't know. It might have come down, but there was also a lot of radio silence when it came with U-boats.
That's
So
true.
their
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to
orders,
validate.
yeah, so their orders at this point, after they've already sailed the entire Atlantic, are many months out of date, at least many weeks.
That's a good point. Yep. And with no updates. That's interesting. I had a question also. The gun at the refinery at, I think it was either Curacao or Aruba, that was firing back at the submarine. Do you think refineries still have guns like that? I'm curious.
Nowadays?
Yeah, I'm not gonna
No.
fire on a refinery. Okay. So this was definitely due to the escalating tensions and conflict.
Yeah, they were
Right.
installed because of the war.
Okay.
They were installed
Yeah,
as defensive batteries for those
yeah.
valuable installations.
That was very good planning on somebody's part, and I think they should get a lot of credit.
I'm sure that if another World War II start, our assets would have anti-air and anti-shipping installed again. But no, right now,
Agreed.
there's no weapons at a refinery.
Okay. I think that would send a message, though, right? Also, you're sailing by, it's like, whoa, not messing with that refinery. Whoa.
I would send a message. I don't know if you want it to be sending the right one, though.
That's true. Yeah, it's like, ooh, man, you're right. Scratch that. Yeah, this is it's so interesting that as Germany seems to have this habit of having this incredible advantage and then saying, well, we're just going to do this, pull a bunch of other people in against us, and it's fine. And that seems like, why are you doing this? Why are you like, yeah, we're just going to march through Belgium in World War I, and oh yeah, we'll pull the UK in, no problem. We're going to take France. Oh, the UK's here. Oh no. Anyway, interesting. Continue.
Just remember, Germany thought they were untouchable.
Early on, they kind of were.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't unjustified, but I think they just did not count on the response. Although they had another conflict just a few decades before where they were in the same situation. So I don't know.
Somebody didn't read their history.
I guess not. But some of these, like the 50-year-old captain of the submarine, clearly served in the German Navy during World War I. They lived it.
Possibly.
They were
But
there.
not necessarily.
You don't think so? 20 years previous? I
Not
guess.
necessarily.
I guess it's not. You're right. Not necessarily. But they had plenty of veterans. They had plenty of veterans that could have known how everything unfolded, and then, or just been kids and their parents were involved, and oh yeah, Germany's doing great, and slowly getting nipped away at until defeat. Or maybe this is just retribution. Who knows? What is the mindset of the... Anyway, let's keep going with the story.
June and August of 1942 are the two worst months of this entire campaign by raw ship count. 48 vessels sunk in June, 46 in August. And if you want to understand what a sustained U-boat campaign actually costs, in human terms rather than tonnage tables, This is where you have to slow down and look at individual ships, because the aggregate numbers will numb you before they teach you anything. Start with the freighter Norlantic, sunk on the morning of May 13th, 90 miles east of Bonaire, while running cargo from Pensacola to Venezuela. U-69, under Captain Lieutenant Ulrich Graf, fired 2 torpedoes from the surface. Both missed. Graf closed to about 2,000 meters and opened up with his deck guns instead, hitting Norlantic at the bridge and setting her ablaze. Her crew launched 2 lifeboats and 2 life rafts and tried to signal that they were abandoning ship. But Graf, by every account we have, never saw or understood that signal and kept shelling a vessel he still believed was fighting him. At 0411 that morning, 3 minutes after a final shell found her boiler room, Norlantic's own captain gave the order to scuttle her. 6 men went down, 2 killed below decks, 4 cut down by the shelling itself during the evacuation. And the survivors spent as long as 37 days adrift on rafts before the last of them were pulled from the water. I want to be precise about what this is and isn't, because the difference matters. This is not a clean case of a U-boat commander deliberately gunning down men in lifeboats after acknowledging their surrender. The evidence points to Graf simply never registering the signal in the chaos and darkness of a running gun action. But it doesn't erase the outcome. 4 of those 6 dead men were killed by shell fire while their shipmates were actively trying to get clear. Whether Graf understood that or not, war doesn't require malice to produce horror. Sometimes fog, darkness, and the captain's tunneled vision on finishing the job are enough. Now, put besides it a different kind of story, because this campaign holds both. On September 27th, the armed Liberty ship, Stephen Hopkins, was returning from Cape Town when she ran into the German auxiliary cruiser Stier. Not a U-boat this time, a disguised merchant raider bristling with concealed guns. Stier ordered Hopkins to stop. The Americans refused. What followed was a genuine gun duel between a converted freighter with a single 4-inch cannon and a purpose-built commerce raider carrying 6 5.9-inch guns. Odds that should have ended in one lopsided massacre. Instead, Hopkins' gun crew, led by a young cadet midshipman named Edwin O'Hara, kept the last working guns firing largely by himself after his crew was killed around him. Put enough shells into Stier to cripple her. By 10 that morning, Hopkins had sunk, but Stier was so badly damaged that her own captain scuttled her less than 2 hours later, rather than try to limp home. One American Liberty ship, lightly armed and heavily outgunned, took a purpose-built raider down with her. That's the other half of this campaign's character. Not just victims, but crews who fought back against impossible odds and occasionally won that fight, even while losing the battle. Edwin O'Hara didn't survive the Stephen Hopkins fight. He was killed still loading and firing that last gun by himself after every other man on the mount had been cut down, and he was awarded the Navy Cross after the war for it. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The closest thing this campaign has had to a single ship, David versus Goliath legend, ends with the American hero dead and his ship on the bottom anyway. The record books call it a tactical victory because Stier never made it home. The men who actually lived it would have called it something closer to a shared grave. That's the texture of these bloodiest months. Not clean triumphs, but trades paid for in very specific names on both sides of every exchange. And as it stood through the end of August, dozens of Allied ships gone in June alone, dozens more in August, tankers and freighters and the men aboard them, spread across a theater stretching from the Yucatan Channel to the Lesser Antilles. Against that toll, exactly 1 U-boat had gone down in these waters by the middle of June. And that kill, when it finally came, would arrive almost as an afterthought. A Coast Guard cutter catching a surface submarine by pure chance rather than any coordinated hunting system. That is the definition of attrition campaign. Nobody was winning yet on the defending side. Months of losses and a single mark on the other. The convoy system that would eventually flip this math was already being drafted on paper in Washington that same summer. It just hadn't reached these waters in time to save any of the men we've just named. And then there's the sheer scale of human wreckage. This campaign created around the Bahamas, specifically, roughly 130 ships went down in and around those islands over the course of the war, and close to 6,000 sailors ended up in the water because of it. Most drowned or died of exposure. Roughly 400 survived long enough to make it ashore. 72 landing in the Turks and Caicos. The rest scattered across the Bahamas themselves. The governor of the Bahamas at the time was Edward VIII, the former king of England, abdicated and exiled to a colonial government ship.
What? Sorry, that is shocking. Okay, keep going. Sorry, I was just blown away by that information.
A man some in British intelligence quietly suspected of German sympathies. And yet the person who actually organized care for those survivors was his wife, Wallis Simpson, running the Bahamas Red Cross, personally meeting nearly every group of survivors that came ashore in Nassau, setting up a canteen and lodging and writing afterward about truly heart-wrenching cases. Men who had drifted for days without food or water under the searing sun. History rarely hands you a detail that clean. A woman married into genuine suspicion of Nazi sympathy, doing the actual, unglamorous work of caring for the direct human wreckage that Nazi torpedoes created. Take it as it is. Don't smooth it into a simpler story than it was.
I always find the details like that not only interesting. For example, the former king of England who abdicated. I remember, so if you've seen the King's Speech, you know this story about Edward abdicating because he's interested in a divorced woman, and that is unacceptable to the crown. I just didn't know where he ended up. That's interesting. But yeah, I have heard stories of former Queen Elizabeth II driving ambulances during this time, during the Blitz of London. A lot of the British just, hey, we're pitching in. We're doing what we can to help the people that are affected by this conflict. I always found that inspiring, frankly. But the suspicion of Nazi sympathies, I know there's a lot of that. Charles Lindbergh, for example, you hear about, oh yeah, he had Nazi sympathies as well. And at this many years out, it's hard to have the proper perspective of what that probably was like then, at the time. We're losing tens of ships a month. What was it, like 48, 50 in June? That's incredible. Thousands of sailors dead. And just nothing has happened from the perspective of the average citizen of the Allies. It's like, yep, the Germans are just sinking our stuff, and we need to ship it, we need to keep going, and maybe it'll make it, maybe it won't. And that's where you're at. And so anybody that has sympathy for the side that's just devastating your side, I'm sure I would probably treat them poorly. It's not, how could you possibly do that? How could you possibly go against your own countrymen? But I'm not totally surprised. That happens in every conflict. There are those that dislike their own side in favor of the opposing side for whatever reason. Golly, thankfully I know how it ends, but this is a very tense moment in the conflict where I'm sure hope is barely hanging on for the Allies. And I didn't know they had submarines in the Caribbean. I knew they had a navy. I didn't know not for nothing, I didn't know they went that far. You know what I mean? I knew their ships could go far. I didn't know they went all the way over there. Anyway, thank you for helping me understand that.
On June 11th, 1942, U-157, hunting 5 miles off the Cuban coast, torpedoed the tanker Hagon, loaded with molasses. Hit her in the engine room, and the blast set off a boiler explosion, followed by a second torpedo. 6 men died, 38 made it to shore. Routine by this campaign's ugly standard. But 2 days later, on June 13th, U-157 herself was caught cruising on the surface southwest of Key West by the Coast Guard cutter UCGC. Theseus. Theseus got sonar contact as the submarine dove and tried to run, laid a depth charge pattern, and after several long minutes, an oil slick and debris broke the surface. First confirmed U-boat kill of the campaign. 4 months in. 8 days after that, on June 30th, a Martin PBM Mariner flying boat commanded by Richard Schrader caught U-158 off Burma and dropped the depth charge that struck the sub's deck, lodged in the teak planking without detonating on impact, and then went off anyway once the submerging boat carried it down to its preset depth, killing everyone on board on a delayed fuse nobody on that U-boat could have anticipated. 2 kills in 18 days doesn't sound like much against 40-some ships lost in June alone. But hold 2 images in your mind at the same time here, because this is the moment the entire trajectory of this campaign starts to bend. Even though nobody living through July of 1942 could have felt it happening yet. Image 1. German U-boats still sinking merchant ships, more or less at will. The same as February. Image 2. A scattered, improvised Allied hunting effort. A Coast Guard cutter here, a long-range flying boat there, starting to actually connect radar contacts and depth charges to dead U-boats for the first time in this theater. Neither image looks decisive on its own. Together, they're the seed of everything that follows. None of this happened by accident, and it didn't happen without a name attached to the effort either. Vice Admiral John H. Hoover had been given command of the newly organized Caribbean Sea Frontier, tasked with knitting together a patchwork of American, British, Dutch, French, and eventually Latin American naval assets into something resembling a single coordinated defense. That's a difficult administrative problem in peacetime, let alone in the middle of a shooting war, with half a dozen flags, half a dozen radio codes, and colonial governments in the mix who didn't always agree on who was in charge of what water. Hoover's early resources were modest. Borrowed destroyers, converted yachts, pressed into sub-chaser duty. Coast Guard cutters like Theseus, who were never designed for this fight. But the escort screen around every tag convoy kept growing through the back half of 1942. British-built corvettes, American patrol craft, Dutch gunboats, all learning sonar procedures and depth charge doctrine essentially on the job, under fire, with no training pipeline built for this water yet. Trinidad itself became a genuine air base of consequence, with British naval air squadrons flying out of Piacro airfield alongside American PBY Catalina patrols, neutrality flights since 1939, and now had a live war to fly. Because the real machines wasn't the individual kills, it was bureaucratic, unglamorous. And it started on July 1st, 1942, when the United States finally inaugurated an interlocking coastal convoy system running down the eastern seaboard and pushed it south as fast as ships and escorts could be found into the Caribbean itself. By the end of August, the first full convoy route was running the triangle between Trinidad, Aruba, and Guantanamo, Cuba, and the Panama Canal. They called them tag convoys for Trinidad, Aruba, Guantanamo. And between that, August and the war's end in this theater, 205 separate tag convoys would run, carrying nearly 3,800 individual ship movements. Compare that to February through June, independent sailings, published schedules, no escorts, no system at all. This is the unglamorous This is the unglamorous truth about how you win an anti-submarine campaign. It isn't usually one brilliant tactical stroke. It's tedious administrative infrastructure, routing tables, escort rosters, radio discipline, built under pressure, arriving months later than anyone wanted, and then quietly strangling the enemy's opportunities, one convoy at a time. Karl Dönitz, watching his captain's patrol reports from Lorient, noticed the change before Washington fully registered its own success. Ships that used to sail alone, lit up on predictable routes, were now bunching into escorted groups, running zigzag patterns with destroyers and corvettes screening them, and aircraft overhead during daylight hours. A U-boat captain who'd spent June picking off unescorted stragglers now had to actually penetrate a screen, survive the escort's counterattack, and hope for a clean shot. An entirely different, far more dangerous kind of hunting. The easy phase of this campaign was ending. Neither side had a name for that moment yet, but the machine had started turning, and would not stop until it ground the entire German effort in these waters down to almost nothing. It's worth saying what this shift actually cost in time, because that's the part of popular memory skips. Building a convoy system from nothing, training escort crews, laying out routing tables, coordinating 5 or 6 different flags worth of warships and aircraft took the better part of 5 months. From that first coastal convoy on June 1st to a fully matured Caribbean network by the following winter. Every one of those months still cost lives. The machine was turning. It just hasn't finished turning yet.
That is something I do not think about very often. When we talk about the conflict in the Atlantic with submarines or just the European campaign with the Allies versus the Axis, I rarely think about any conflict in the Caribbean. And this was strategic from almost day one. And it's interesting to see how that unfolded and how that influenced the strategy to counter submarine tactics generally. So the zigzag patterns, the escorts, the convoys, on top of, I remember in previous episodes we talked about different aircraft spotting, different techniques to find the submarines so we could either avoid them or attack them. And all that takes really dedicated work. And I think a lot of people, I don't know if it's just the illusion of movies and television that, oh, one clear idea comes into focus and that solves everything. No, you are right to say that it's a lot of tedious work. A lot of people working behind the scenes, making calculations, trying things, failing, and then eventually coming up with a solution that works. And then you keep refining to see how it can work better. It's like, maybe we don't need as many escort ships, or maybe we need more, or whatever the case may be. And by doing that and successfully getting supplies from the Western Hemisphere into the main theater of war, you're forcing the enemy to bolster their efforts in the theater of war. And I would imagine that's why it's dwindling in the Caribbean. But just the amount of loss it took to get to that point is astounding. Just not just material, but human lives. And I will say, if I'm a sailor and I'm on a freighter and we're sailing through these dangerous waters and our cargo is molasses, I'm a lot more comfortable than if our cargo is petroleum. You know what I mean? If a torpedo hits, yeah, there may be some casualties, but it's not going to be an incendiary bomb. Might get sticky. Not to make light of being sunk by a submarine. That's a horrible situation. But given the choice, I would be on the molasses ship.
Well, just off topic, if you remember, I believe it was New York having that molasses tower collapse.
Oh,
Molasses is flammable.
what?
I believe
I guess I've
so.
never tried to set it on fire. Yeah, it's a hydrocarbon. Makes sense. It's not explosive, but if it is all over you and you catch on fire, I'm sure it's hard to get off of you. So that could be a whole different can of beans. Huh. Well, I stand by my original choice.
On August 28th, 1942, U-94 was working against convoy TAW-15 off the coast of Haiti when the escort screen actually caught her in the act. First, an American PBY Catalina spotted her and dropped the bombing run. Then the Canadian corvettes HMCS Halifax and HMCS Snowberry closed in. HMCS Oakville and a third Canadian corvette fired a depth charge pattern that forced U-94 to the surface. And here's where this fight stops being a standard depth charge kill and turns into something almost nobody expects from a 1942 anti-submarine action. Oakville rammed the surfaced submarine twice, rammed her hard enough to stop her dead in the water, and then came alongside the crippled boat and did something that was extremely rare in the entire war. Sent a boarding party across. Sub-Lieutenant Hal Lawrence led 11 sailors from Oakville's deck towards U-94. Most of them were shirtless and barefoot. There hadn't been time to dress for a boarding action. They were simply the men on watch when the order came, armed with whatever revolvers and grenades were on hand. Only 2 of the 11 actually made it down through the conning tower hatch onto U-94's deck and inside her hull. Lawrence and Stroker Petty Officer Arthur Powell. 2 German sailors came running at them in the passage below. The Canadians ordered them to halt. When the Germans didn't stop, Lawrence and Powell opened fire and killed both men. That's close quarters killing in a steel tube barely wide enough for one man to pass, by 2 sailors who'd been aboard their own ship peeling potatoes an hour earlier. The rest of U-94's crew surrendered without further resistance. Lawrence pushed further into the boat, trying to reach the code room and grab an intact Enigma material and charts before the submarine went down. The intelligence prize that could be worth more than the kill itself. He didn't make it. The Germans had already opened the scuttling valves, and Lawrence had to abandon the search and get himself and Powell back out as the boat visibly settled lower in the water beneath them. U-94 sank with 19 of her crew still aboard. Oakville rescued 26 survivors, including her captain. Wait, what actually happened here for a second? A corvette's crew, men trained for sonar watches and depth charge drills, not hand-to-hand boarding actions, improvised an assault on a still-armed enemy warship because their captain saw the opportunity and simply took it. No doctrine told Oakville's skipper to ram a surfaced U-boat and send men across. He made that call in the moment, and it worked. And it very easily could not have. 6 days later, on September 3rd, a different kind of kill closed out this stretch of the campaign. U-162 was detected north of Trinidad by 3 British destroyers, HMS Vimy, HMS Pathfinder, and HMS Quinton, and battered with depth charges until she went down. 2 Germans died in the attack, 49 survived and went into American custody as prisoners of war, where interrogators pulled valuable intelligence out of them about U-boat operations and the Lorient structure. U-162's captain, Captain Lieutenant Jurgen van Tenberg, went into an American POW camp and, in a footnote almost nobody remembers, escaped from that camp in late 1944, more than 2 years after his boat went down, before being recaptured about a month later. Even the men in this campaign, supposedly finished off, kept finding ways to complicate the tidy version of this story. Otto Etis was 25 years old and already a decorated commander when Oakville pulled him out of the water. One of Dornit's rising stars, groomed for the kind of aggressive, opportunistic captaincy this theater had rewarded so richly back in February. 6 months later, he was a prisoner in an Allied camp, and the boat he commanded was resting on the floor of the Caribbean, with 19 of his men still inside her. That reversal, Golden Boy captain to POW in half a year, is the shape of what was happening to the entire U-boat arm in these waters during this stretch, not just to Etis personally. Compare it to the record from February. 3 A-20 Havoc bombers scrambled off brand new island airstrips, dropping everything they had at Hartenstein's boats and hitting nothing. 7 months later, a converted Corvette's boarding party is killing German sailors with pistols inside the hull of a captured submarine. That's not a subtle shift in the balance of this campaign. That's the entire balance of power flipping over, month by month, contact by contact, while both sides were still learning the new rules in real time. Add up what these two actions represent together in the space of 1 week, the Allied escort effort in the Caribbean went from scattered lucky kills, a Coast Guard cutter here, a flying boat there, to something approaching a coordinated, aggressive hunting posture. Multi-ship, multi-nation task groups actively closing with detected U-boats and finishing them. Sometimes with tactics as improvised and reckless as a unarmored corvette ramming a warship twice and sending barefoot sailors down her hatch. The hunted were starting to become the hunters. And both sides in these waters were about to find out how far that reversal was going to run.
You bring up the difference just in a few months of how this has swung. And I imagine that if you were a captain in the German Navy early on, so 1939, 1940, and you were assigned a submarine, that would have been a prized position. You would have gotten fame and glory and everything that comes with being a successful or just a success in war. But then as time goes on and the Allies get more coordinated and the anti-submarine efforts get more intense, being assigned a submarine looks more like a death sentence almost. It's very sketchy, something that you would probably take a lot more reluctantly. You would take it because it's your duty, but there would be a lot more hesitation, and the chance of glory, I'm sure, has dwindled significantly because of these efforts. And having a submarine boarded, that seems like it would have been a pipe dream for the Allies early on, much less destroying them so frequently and getting the intelligence from captured sailors. And again, a lot of dedicated effort, a lot of people working in conjunction with each other to make that happen. That is frankly amazing. I know we had POW camps in America for German soldiers in particular. I think in the Montana, Wyoming, remote areas generally. I've not heard too many stories about escaped POWs and what they do in America to survive. That's wild. I would like to learn more about that in a future episode. But anyway, I cannot overemphasize the dedication that it took the U.S. Navy, just the military generally, the Navy specifically, but also coordinating with so many other countries, nations, colonies, to get this net to close in more tightly around a common enemy. That really takes a lot of effort.
Here's what nobody caught in the moment, because turning points almost never announce themselves. They only look obvious after. On a graph, months later. In September of 1942, ship sinkings across the Caribbean theater dropped from 46 in August to 25. In October, they fell again, down to the lowest monthly total since the campaign's second month back in April. And in December 1942, for the first time since Werner Hartenstein's torpedo hits Pernalis in San Nicolas Harbor, not a single Allied ship was sunk anywhere in the Caribbean theater for an entire month. 0. After a year that had opened with simultaneous strikes across 400 miles of coastline and built to 48 ships lost in a single June, the theater had been the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. Went completely, eerily quiet. That's not luck. That's the TAG convoy system. Trinidad, Aruba, Guantanamo. finally running at full strength, escorted by a growing screen of corvettes, destroyers, and Coast Guard cutters, packed by PBY and PBM patrol aircraft, flying daylight cover over every convoy leg. Remember what a U-boat captain used to face here in February. Escorted tankers, running lit up on published schedules. By autumn, that same captain faced escorted formations, aircraft overhead, and a hunting response that had gone from a single lucky cutter catching a surface boat to coordinated multi-ship task groups, actively closing on sonar contacts. The entire economics of the hunt had inverted. A U-boat patrol that used to guarantee 2 or 3 easy kills now risked the boat itself for a shrinking chance at any kill at all. Karl Donitz understood arithmetic better than almost any commander of the war. And arithmetic is exactly what killed his interest in the Caribbean. He built his entire doctrine around tonnage, the idea that Britain could be strangled if U-boats sank merchant shipping faster than Allied shipyards could replace it. Wherever in the world that tonnage could be found cheapest. In February, the Caribbean had been the cheapest hunting ground on the map. Unescorted ships, undefended harbors, refineries that hadn't even finished building their airstrips. By the end of 1942, it had become one of the most heavily defended and least productive theaters left. Donitz didn't need a dramatic single battle to tell him the Caribbean was finished as an efficient hunting ground. He had the sinking curve in front of him, month over month, and he read it exactly the way you'd expect a man obsessed with tonnage per boat per day to read it. He started pulling his most capable captains and boats back north, towards the still contested North Atlantic convoy lanes, where the tonnage math still favored him for a little while longer. That reassessment wasn't purely voluntary either. And the honest version of the story has to include the second push. On November 8th, 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. And suddenly, Donitz needed every boat he could find concentrated off the Straits of Gibraltar to interdict that invasion fleet. So this wasn't purely a case of Donitz calmly reading a sinking curve and drawing the rational conclusion. He's also being pulled away by a more urgent fire elsewhere, which meant the Caribbean's collapse was accelerated by outside events as much by its own math. Both things happened at once. The convoy system had already made this hunting ground far less efficient than it used to be. And Operation Torch gave Donitz an urgent, competing reason to move his boats regardless. Cause and effect rarely arrived one at a time in a war this size. Put real numbers against that curve, because they tell the same story as the month-by-month collapse. Across 1942, German and Italian submarines sank 336 ships in the Caribbean theater, totaling roughly 1.5 million tons, a staggering fraction of everything the Allies lost worldwide that year. In 1943, after the withdrawal Donitz ordered, that number collapsed to 35 ships. By 1944, it was down to 3. That is not a gradual decline. That's a campaign getting switched off almost entirely within 12 months. And it happened because the man running it made a calculated, defensible decision to stop feeding boats into a theater that had gone from the most efficient hunting ground in this entire war to one of the least efficient, virtually overnight. Not every historian agrees Donitz called that shift correct, and this is worth sitting with rather than resolving too neatly. Some post-war analysts have argued the German withdrawal from the Caribbean came too early and too completely. That a more patient, better resource commitment to this theater in early 1943, even against a maturing convoy system, could have kept tying down Allied escorts and aircraft that were badly needed elsewhere. At a moment when Allied anti-submarine resources were still stretched thin across multiple oceans. Whether that's a fair critique or hindsight dressed up as strategy is genuinely open argument. What isn't open to argument is the result on the water. A theater that had bled the Allies for 10 months went almost completely silent within a year. And the men who built and fought that convoy system earned every bit of that silence. There's an irony in this that historians still argue about, and it belongs in the honest version of the story. Donitz never knew and never accepted, even when his own staff raised the possibility, that Allied code breakers had cracked significant portions of the German naval Enigma cipher, intelligence that let convoy routers steer ships away from the concentrations of U-boats before they ever made contact. After the war, Donitz insisted the real killer had been radar and long-range patrol aircraft, not broken codes. And he went to his grave believing that. He wasn't entirely wrong. Radar and aircraft were devastating, but he was also provably missing at least half of what had actually beaten him in these waters. That blind spot didn't just cost him the Caribbean. It would go on costing the entire U-boat arm dearly for the rest of the war. Right through the catastrophic losses of May 1943, that German sailors themselves would come to call Black May.
I find it very interesting that we're only, in the past maybe couple of decades, learning about the Allies' success in decrypting the Enigma machine, at least partially, and how effective that was in helping them to circumvent a lot of what the Germans were throwing at them. That certainly, capturing that machine and then also decoding it was a miracle. I think that was amazing. As far as committing troops to the theater of war and not the Atlantic or just the main continent and North Africa and everything, I think that's completely justified. You have to have a perspective, like a omniscient perspective, to understand that, yeah, maybe he could have done this a little bit differently, but I think he did pretty well with the information that he had at hand, and knowing that he didn't know how thinly stretched the Americans were or the Allies were, and where they were committing aircraft and ships. And I'm sure he had some idea, but knowing that, our source of petroleum in the African Middle East area is under assault, we need to protect that. And so it's a reversal of what we saw at the beginning of this episode, where what was keeping England afloat in the Caribbean was under attack, and they needed to figure out some way to defend that, and eventually they did. And now it's the Axis turn to try to do the exact same thing. But by then, there was so much momentum from the Allied side and so many parties that had joined in. Like you said, Mexico was neutral, but I'm sure they're a very resource-rich nation, and I'm sure if whoever they're supplying is going to have just that much more in an advantage against their enemy. So many decisions built to this eventual conclusion. And yeah, being able to successfully transport goods, material, aircraft, personnel to the front eventually pushed everything that way. And it's amazing. Hooray for the U.S. Navy and the British Navy. They were very helpful. But I'm just very impressed with how the Allies worked to get to this point.
Between January and July of 1943, not a single friendly ship was lost anywhere near Trinidad. The same stretch of water that 18 months earlier had been Weinar's Hartenstein's hunting ground on the opening night of Operation Neuland. The campaign wasn't officially over. It just had almost nothing left to accomplish, and both sides knew it. What remained through 1943 was a mop-up, fought by the handful of boats and commanders who either hadn't gotten the order to withdraw yet or had decided to squeeze one last patrol out of waters that used to make careers. Remember Hartenstein's himself, because his story needs to close here, and it closes badly. 6 months after the man who opened this entire campaign at St. Nicholas Harbor he'd gone on to become one of the more complicated figures of the entire U-boat war. In September 1942, in the mid-Atlantic rather than the Caribbean, Hartenstein's U-156 torpedoed the British liner Leuconia, only to discover, once survivors started coming up out of the water, that she'd been carrying more than 2,000 Italian prisoners of war alongside British civilians and troops. Hartenstein made the extraordinary decision to surface, broadcast his position and intentions in the clear on an international frequency, and began an open rescue operation, taking survivors aboard his own submarine and radioing for other ships to assist under a declared ceasefire. He was, by any honest reading, trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation his own war had created. It didn't stay simple. An American bomber working off information that didn't include Dornit's rescue broadcast attacked U-156 mid-rescue, forcing Hartenstein to cast the survivors adrift and dive. The incident led directly to what the German Navy called the Luconia Order, a directive banning U-boat crews from ever again attempting to rescue survivors of ships they'd sunk, a policy that would harden this entire war's treatment of shipwrecked sailors for its remaining 3 years. Hartenstein was awarded the Knight's Cross for the rescue attempt itself, and 6 months after that, on March 8, 1943, an American aircraft caught U-156 off Barbados and sank her with all hands. Hartenstein was 35. The man who opened this campaign at San Nicolas Harbor closed his own war in the same theater where he'd started, a little over a year later, and he never came home. 2 more actions closed out this theater's active fighting. On May 15, 1943, 3 small Cuban Navy submarine chasers were escorting the freighters Camagua and Honduran Hanks from La Grande towards Havana, where an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted U-176, shadowing the convoy, and dropped a smoke marker over her position. The Cuban chaser CS-13 under Alferez de Fagando and Mario Ramirez Delgado picked the submarine up on sonar and put down a depth charge pattern that sank U-176 with her entire crew. The first and only U-boat sunk in this war by a Latin American Navy acting alone. A overlooked footnote in a campaign already thin on popular recognition. And in July 1943, U-759 fought what amounted to the campaign's last gasp. On July 5th, she sank the American steamer Maltrain, part of a Guantanamo-bound convoy. 2 days later, she sank the Dutch cargo ship Pulo Robia, east of Jamaica. The morning after that second sinking, a PBM Mariner flying boat bombed her position, and American surface escorts spent 7 straight hours depth charging the area without confirming a kill. U-759 escaped that day undamaged. She survived barely 2 more weeks. On July 23rd, an American PBM finally caught and sank her for good, southwest of Haiti. With her went the last German submarine operating with any persistence in Caribbean waters. The theater that had opened with 5 U-boats sinking 4 harbors in a single coordinated hour closed 17 months later with a single hunted boat running out of places to hide. Take a moment with Mario Ramirez Delgado and his crew, because that more than a footnote's worth of attention. Cuba was a small nation with a small navy, flying a flag that most of the belligerent powers barely accounted for in the planet. And its sailors put a wartime kill on the board that no Latin American navy would match again in this conflict. It happened with 3 modest submarine chasers, a spotter aircraft, and a smoke float. None of the glamour of a destroyer squadron or a purpose-built escort carrier. Just competent seamanship applied at the right moment. That's true of nearly every kill cataloged in this final phase. No dramatic set-piece battles, no fleet actions. Just patient, increasingly professional hunters, closing in on increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate U-boats, one contact at a time, until there was simply nothing German left in those waters to hunt. A campaign that opened with the shock of total surprise closed slowly and without ceremony. In the opposite mode, routine, methodical, almost bureaucratic in its thoroughness. That quiet ending is easy to rush past. It shouldn't be. It took 17 months, thousands of men on both sides, and an enormous amount of unglamorous administrative and technical effort to get there.
I had never heard that the Cuban Navy did that. I think that's cool. I really do. And I'm surprised that we had talked about Venezuela participating earlier as far as just at the beginning of the episode, and Mexico getting pulled into the fight. But neither of them were as successful as little Cuba was in this effort as far as being able to sink a submarine. And sinking a submarine sounds difficult unless you have the coordination and technology to do so. So the fact that they were able to do so at all is amazing. But that's really impressive. And again, for a world war and a conflict that you hear about major battles, usually in Europe, North Africa, Pacific Theater, I don't hear about the Caribbean. And this is more information than I had. And the participants are larger, like greater in number than I had imagined also. So not only do I know more about this aspect of the conflict, I know who was involved, why, and then specifically like with Donitz and some of the captains of the U-boats and what their eventual fate was. That, gosh, thank you, Dale. That's what I want to say. I always enjoy learning more, and this episode I certainly have. So thank you.
Here's what this campaign actually cost, laid out plainly without softening the numbers. In 1942 alone, German and Italian submarines sank 336 ships in the Caribbean theater, totaling 1,559,422 tons. In 1943, as the convoy system matured and Karl Donitz withdrew his boats north, that fell to 35 ships and 177,945 tons. By 1944, it was down to 3 ships and 14,804 tons, a rounding error next to the year before it. Across the broader Caribbean theater, from the opening night at San Nicolas Harbor through the last confirmed action, close to 400 Allied ships went to the bottom. That single year of 1942 on its own accounted for roughly 36% of all Allied shipping losses recorded anywhere on Earth. More than a third of everything the Allies lost worldwide that year happened in these waters, in a theater most people alive today couldn't place on a map. Set the German side of it next to it, and the asymmetry gets uncomfortable. Only somewhere around 10 to 12 U-boats were sunk in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico combined across the entire campaign. U-157, U-158, U-94, U-162, U-176, U-759, and a small handful of others, against nearly 400 Allied ships and thousands of merchant sailors and naval personnel killed or drowned. Do that math honestly, and the early ratio running through the back half of 1942 was almost obscenely lopsided in Germany's favor. Dozens of Allied ships lost for every U-boat that didn't come home. It's only once you run the tally across the entire campaign, all the way through the mop-up actions of 1943, that the picture evens out into something closer to a lasting Allied strategic victory. Both of these readings are true, and historians still argue about which one deserves more weight: the brutal early exchange rate or the eventual hard-won reversal. I'd rather give you both numbers than pick one that makes for a cleaner story. So we want to flag this because it's the kind of figure that gets repeated without its context. Some accounts of the wider Caribbean theater cite an eventual kill ratio as favorable as 23 Allied merchant ships sunk for every U-boat lost. A number that sounds almost like Allied failure rather than victory, until you notice it's measuring the entire campaign's tonnage exchange rather than the strategic outcome. A tonnage ratio and a strategic verdict are not the same measurement, and this campaign is a good example of why. Germany could sink ship after ship and still lose the campaign outright, because the actual objective was never sink the most ships. It was strangle the Allied war economy, and that objective failed completely. Keep both numbers in your head at once: a brutal exchange rate on the water and a total strategic failure on the map. Neither one cancels the other out, and reducing this campaign to a single tidy ratio raises exactly the tension that makes it worth studying. There's also a broader American toll worth placing beside these Caribbean specific figures, carefully without conflating the two. Across the entire Second World War, the United States Merchant Marine lost somewhere in the range of 700 to 1,500 ships, depending on how you count Marine casualties alongside combat losses. And the mariner death toll is genuinely disputed, cited anywhere from around 6,600 to over 9,000, depending on which official tally you're reading and what it includes. I'd rather hand you that range honestly than pretend the number is settled, because it isn't, even among the merchant mariners' own histories. What every version of that count agrees on is it's grim, regardless of which end you land. Merchant mariners died at a rate of roughly 1 in 26 who served, the highest casualty rate of any American service in the war, uniformed or not. The Caribbean and Gulf campaign was never the whole of that toll, but it was an outsized, disproportionate share of it, concentrated into a shockingly narrow window of 10 to 12 months, against merchant crews who had, in February 1942, no convoys, no armed guards, and in many cases, no advance warning that a war had arrived in their home waters at all. Now, what did all of that actually buy strategically for either side? For the Axis, remarkably little that lasted. Operation Neuland inflicted real serious damage in its opening months. American East Coast oil deliveries from the Gulf and Caribbean dropped to roughly a quarter by the end of 1942. But it never came close to actually severing the flow of Venezuelan crude. Curacao and Aruba, refined product, or Guanese bauxite, that entire war machine depended on. Not one of the three great refineries, Isla de Cargo, Isla de Curacao, Lago, or Aruba, Puerto Pierre on Trinidad, was ever knocked permanently offline. The oil kept moving. The aluminum kept moving. The Panama Canal never closed for a single day. For the Allies, the strategic payoff ran well beyond simply keeping the oil flowing. This theater became, in effect, a live fire training ground where the United States, Britain, Canada, the Netherlands, and a growing roster of Latin American navies, Cuban, Mexican, Venezuelan, built the actual operation muscle of convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare from scratch, under real fire, before that same expertise got exported north into the far larger and even more decisive North Atlantic convoy battles of 1943. The radar doctrine, the depth charge tactics, the routing discipline, the sheer administrative machinery of running 205 TAG convoys and 3,800 ship movements without losing the war's oil supply. All of that got learned here first, paid for in ships and names, before it ever got applied to the fight that history books remember as decisive. Every tanker that survived a TAG convoy run in 1944 was sailing safely because of lessons bought at real cost in these waters 2 years earlier. That's the actual accounting. Not a clean victory margin, a brutal opening exchange, a hard-fought reversal, and a strategic payoff that quietly kept the entire war machine fueled all the way through to the invasion still to come.
I appreciate that perspective. Trying to understand the full scope of the damage that submarines did, the sacrifices that merchant marines went through, that's way bigger than I thought, frankly. I did have a question. So you mentioned tonnage lost, and then also the ratio of tonnage from Allied ships sinking to submarines lost. I'm a little unclear as to what that means. Is that the weight of the ship or the cargo capacity of the ship, or what exactly is that?
It's the cargo.
Okay. And so I imagine submarines' cargo isn't very large, right?
Well, it also includes the weight of the ship.
Okay,
but the cargo is the important part of what you're
the tonnage.
sinking.
Yeah, because if you're an empty tanker, but there's a difference between that and then a tanker full of munitions or molasses or whatever. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that is a lot of loss. You think about all the energy that goes into producing material, bauxite into aluminum, petroleum into gasoline, or what have you, and then the people that come along and help. I was just thinking about when you mentioned those sailors, their ship was taken out from under them. They went into the water, they came back, and then they had to get on another ship to help transport something else because that's the job. That's incredible. And that's what needed to be done. And there were people that just put their lives on the line to make sure those supply chains were running. And I don't know, I'm stunned. This is a good insight into what a portion of a conflict that I thought I was familiar with, but I learn more and more that I'm not because there are certain elements that just added to the overall story that I was missing. So I appreciate that.
Ask most people to name a naval campaign of the Second World War, and you'll get Midway. You'll get the North Atlantic convoy battles, maybe D-Day's naval bombardment, maybe Leyte Gulf if they know their Pacific history. You will almost never get the Battle of the Caribbean, despite the fact that this theater absorbed more than a third of everything the Allies lost worldwide in the single worst year of the entire U-boat war. This is a historical injustice, and it's worth asking why it happened. Part of it is geography. This was a war fought against merchant ships, not battleships, and merchant losses have always registered less in popular memory than a single sunk capital ship with a dramatic name. Part of it is chronologically. The worst of it was over by the time most Americans had finished mobilizing for the wider war. Wrapped up and quiet before Guadalcanal or North Africa had even become household names. And part of it, honestly, is that there was no single decisive battle here to build a legend around. No Midway, no Leyte Gulf, just 10 months of refineries under fire, tankers burning in harbors, and a slow, unglamorous convoy system grinding an enemy fleet down to nothing. History rewards a clean story with a beginning, middle, and end. This campaign's real ending was a whimper, a hunted U-boat running out of hiding places in July 1943, not a headline. The recognition where it exists has come slowly and imperfectly. The East Coast Memorial in Battery Park, New York, didn't add inscription honoring merchant marine losses in 1941, nearly half of a century after these men died. A matching edition was approved for the West Coast Memorial in 1992, and for reasons nobody ever fully explained, it sat unfinished for more than 3 decades before it was finally completed in May of 2025. Let me say that again. Sailors who burned alive off Aruba in February 1942 waited 83 years for their country to finish carving their service into a wall on the opposite coast from where most of them died. That is not how a nation is supposed to treat the men who kept its oil and its aluminum moving when its own coastline was undefended. It's how a nation treats a war it would rather remember through its victories than its costs. So let's do the part popular history keeps skipping. Let's name some of them. 6 men went down with the Norlantic on May 13th, 1942, killed by torpedo and shell fire, while their shipmates tried to reach lifeboats that were still in the water when the coup de grace hit. 8 men died aboard the Dardanelles in the opening minutes of this entire campaign, burned in crude oil that caught fire around them in San Nicolas Harbor. Cadet Midshipman Edwin O'Hara died alone at his gun aboard Stephen Hopkins, taking a German raider down with him. 19 German sailors went down inside U-94 off Haiti, killed or drowned after their own captain's crew had already opened the scuttling valves beneath 2 boarding Canadians. 2 men died defending U-162 off Trinidad, and 47 more sank with U-176 off Havana, killed to the last man by Cuban submarine chasers' depth charges. 7 American sailors died aboard the gunboat USS Erie, grounded and burned off Curacao in November 1942 after a torpedo she never managed to fully evade. And Werner Hartenstein, the man who opened this whole campaign at St. Nicholas, who later tried at real risk to his own boat to save more than 1,000 strangers from the sinking Leuconia, died with his entire crew off Barbados in March 1943, in the same waters where his war and this campaign had both begun. I'd add one more name to this list. It's not a casualty. Alferez de Faga Mario Ramirez Linares Delgado and the crew of that small Cuban submarine chaser deserve to be remembered too. Because recognition in this campaign shouldn't only mean naming the dead. It should mean naming the men who did the unglamorous, competent work of actually winning it. In a small boat under a flag that history rarely bothers to credit. The same goes for Hal Lawrence and Arthur Powell, and the 2 Canadians who went down a submarine's hatch with pistols and grenades and came back up alive. And it goes for the merchant crews who kept sailing this route in early 1942 with no armed guard, no convoy, and no illusions about the odds, simply because the oil and the ore had to move regardless. Recognition done honestly has to hold both at once. The names lost and the names who did the fighting that eventually stopped the losing. None of these names get a Wikipedia info box the size of Midway's. Most of them don't get remembered at all, outside a handful of naval historians and families who still keep their photographs. But the oil kept moving because of what was paid here. The aluminum kept moving. The canal never closed. Every bomber built from every gallon of Venezuelan crude that kept a British airfield, every tanker that sailed attack convoy route in 1944 without incident, all of it rides on the backs of the men whose names I just said out. That's the actual legacy of the Battle of the Caribbean. Not a famous battle, a supply line that held. At a cost, most of the country never learned to count.
That is so perfectly said. I think that really encapsulates the scope, the kind of the mystery for a lot of folks of what happened and the humanity. So I can't think of a better note to sign off on. So thank you so much, listeners, for joining us today. I hope you learned something like I did. And if you ever want to get a hold of us, there's a couple of different ways you can do that, and we encourage you to do so. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter. Our handle is nhistorypod. And while you're listening, while we've got you, if you want to go ahead and rate this show, or leave a comment, or tell a friend, a family member, a coworker, or somebody about this show that you think would enjoy this, please do. We see the statistics every week, and we see folks listening, and it's pretty nice. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to catch you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye.